Tonight is all about procedural fairness. Yay, our favorite topic, right? So procedural fairness, it's amazing. I admit what we talk about when we talk about fairness. But it's such a huge part of what we talk about and what we think about in admin law. And most of the course is going to be devoted to that. Your midterm in October is going to be on procedural fairness issue to take advantage of the fact that that's what we're doing in the first few classes. And so, as I was saying before, when it comes to procedural fairness, you kind of want to have your procedural fairness hat on and be thinking about, what's the language that we use, how do we approach a procedural fairness problem. And I'm going to hand out, not just yet, but tonight, this one-page procedural fairness framework. It's actually uploaded. You can go have a look, but I'll hand it out soon. And we'll go through that. And what I like about this is that it's kind of one stop for everything, so you don't forget anything. And it really, to me, it goes through the analysis in the right order. But right now, if you look at it, you're going to say, okay, how does that help me? As we go through and we're learning the kind of all the key pieces of the puzzle, when you go back, you're going to say, oh, okay, I sort of now see how it all fits together. Right now, it's going to be really hard to do that. I'll still give it to you tonight, just to kind of introduce it. But again, as I was saying, it'll be more useful to you later on, not so much right now. So we're over this class. The next class, we're just going to be doing the building blocks of procedural fairness. So one of the things we sort of like to start with on procedural fairness is, what I have here, sources of procedural fairness. But we're going to start off, what is procedural fairness? And then sources, where does it come from? Where do we find it? It's like a resource, Where do we go looking for procedural fairness? Well, it comes from certain places, which you're going to see. And here's a couple of the sort of hints of where we're going with that. We have the common law. We have things called general procedural statutes. And there's more, because it could also come from, do you guys know what I mean when I say the home statute? What's a home statute? No? Weird term? Statute that has to do with your home? Yeah, exactly. And that's a good time to talk about it. So remember, we talked about how the legislature says, sort of back to the beginning of time, the legislature, legislature in Ontario, at one time, long time ago, if people had disagreements, they go to court, right? Or if they want some kind of justice, they go to court. And then at some point, 100 years ago or more, the legislature says, we don't like that. The courts, they're okay, they're good for what they are good at, but they're really not very good at all kinds of stuff. So we need to create DMs. It's a short form, right? DM. We need to create these tribunals, agencies. So what do? They pass a statute that says, starting today, there's going to be this thing called the, Commissioner of Privacy. It's random. A privacy commissioner. We're going to create a privacy commissioner out of the blue. There's a person now called the privacy commissioner, and we're going to give him or her a bunch of powers, right? We're going to create it. It's playing God, kind of bringing this thing into existence, and then giving it powers and duties and functions. So there's different ways. Some legislatures like to create this thing and then say, give it all kinds of direction. This is how I want you to work. I want you to do this kind of hearing, and here's how I want you to do it, and these are your powers, to resolve matters, like do orders or recommendations. Remember we talked about all that. But there's a wide variety. Some legislatures just kind of go, okay, we're going to create a thing called a commissioner, and commissioner, you figure it out. Okay, and the poor commissioner has to figure out how to do their job. But for the most part, they almost always, the legislature will say something. So they bring it into existence, and they say, oh, you can do, written hearings, and here's how you should do it. So when we say, sources of procedural fairness, well, really the first place to look is the home statute. So the commissioner's home statute. We have a home statute called the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. Creates the commissioner, brings that person into existence, gives it some powers and duties, right? But like our statute, like almost all these others I'm talking about, there's a kind of a section on fairness and procedure. There's a section on procedure. So it's going to tell you a little bit of a story about what the legislature, had in its mind about how it wanted the commissioner to do its hearings, handle its cases. Right? So the first place we usually look is we look there because that could give us an answer to a question, a procedural fairness question. Or we might look to the common law, which we're going to spend a long time on because that's the hardest part. It's figuring out procedural fairness and common law. What is it? How do we sort it out? And that's where we spend a lot of time on cases like Baker. All right, because that gives us the whole common law analysis for procedural fairness. Then there's a thing called general procedural statutes. I won't ruin that surprise. That'll be coming. So there's a bit to talk about there. But the biggie is common law. Okay. And we're going to take a little time, even though we introduced it last week, talking about, well, what is procedural fairness and how do we kind of break it down into pieces. There's different elements of procedural fairness. Okay, so procedural fairness, you can think of it as the procedural rights a person is owed. Okay. Another way I like to look at it, because I think it's easier to remember, this idea of procedural benefits. Everybody wants procedural benefits. We're going to learn about what all those procedural benefits might be. Okay? But a right a person is owed, a procedural right a person is owed. That's how we think about it. And who's a person? Who are we talking about here? Yeah, or any person affected by what one of these DMs is going to do or has done. Yeah, okay. So one way of breaking down, the world of procedural fairness, because it's so big and scary, especially at common law, we ask these two questions. And I introduced this last week. Is a duty of procedural fairness owed to the person? Right? And we learned the shocking and distressing fact that sometimes the answer to that question is no. Right? Sometimes it's no. In our world, for the most part, the answer is going to be yes. But you have to keep in mind, oh boy, I could encounter a situation where the answer to that question is no, and then there's no procedural fairness rights at common law. We're going to learn about how and why that might be. But again, remember that would be like a small minority of situations. Most of the time, the stuff that we talk about, the cases that we talk about, the answer is yes. It's fairly easy.
That was like your example last week about my phone rates went up and we don't think the phone, we didn't have duty to consult with everybody.
Yeah, me or me.
Yeah.
Or everybody, yeah. Right, so and we're gonna go deeper on that and explore that, but yeah, that idea that, well, if they're making a decision that's general, that affects like the whole population or a huge part of the population, then we say, well, no, you're not really on procedural fairness rights, because it's general, not specific, like, one, like our jockey friend, right? One person who's affected, so of course, they're gonna have the right procedural fairness. But yeah, I'll bring that example out again to help us, to remind us of, when might that be the case where the answer is no? The phone rates, we're gonna raise phone rates. But we're deciding whether to allow phone rates to go up. Well, that's a general kind of decision. It affects a general part of the population. Okay, so the answer could be no. We know it's usually yes. So we say, if yes, what does that mean? Awesome. If yes, then it breaks down into two benefits, kind of categories of benefits, because under those two things, there's all kinds of stuff. But we have the right to a bias-free decision, and we have the right to be heard. This is really simplifying it, which is good because we want to start with the simple before we get into all this crazy detail. We want to get just a basic grip on what we're talking about. So you're entitled to a bias-free decision and the right to be heard. And then we get into the following, the question that comes after that, which is, well, what's the content of those rights? What does a bias-free decision mean? And the answer is always, well, it depends. What does the right to be heard mean? Well, it depends. So it's you just can't answer that. But we know that we need to think about what those two rights mean for us in our situation, right? And remember, the jockey who's losing his license to do his job, his profession, versus me. What did I say? Fishing? What did I say? Or no, boating license. Fishing license. Boating license. Fishing food. Yeah. I'm a recreational boater, right? So I might be able to say, yeah, I'm owed a duty of fairness, but the content's probably going to be a lot lower, right? For me, because what's at stake? Well, not that much compared to our friend over there who is not going to be able to make a living, right? Really very, very serious. Opposite ends of the spectrum. Okay. We're going to talk about that jockey one for the entire course. Okay. So there's other sources of procedural fairness, and don't worry if this is not all straight. We're introducing this stuff. So sometimes the Charter, Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and the Federal Bill of Rights provide us with procedural fairness benefits. Okay, it's not a charter class, but we have to know that little that little slice of the Charter and a little slice of the Bill of Rights. It's really one section of the Charter. Two sections in the Bill of Rights are very, very similar to each other, where we could find procedural rights in our favor. And we can use those. We'll find out how. Of course, statutes, I use enabling statute, that's another term. I hated in law, there's like 4 different terms for the same thing. Enabling statute, home statute, originating statute, I think is another term. But all that is just, the statute that created this DM. Pretty simple. Of course, yeah, it could be regulations under the statute, because sometimes you read the statute and you say, well, there's not much here, and then you go to the regulations, like, whoa, well, there's all kinds of stuff in here about procedure. Not surprising, you could see it there in the regulations. Let's spell out procedural benefits. Okay, sometimes DMs have policies or guidelines on procedure. So we were talking last week about their website. You call the website and they say, welcome to the Ontario Rental Housing Tribunal. Here's how we do our hearings. We have these rules. So here they are. If you're interested, go read the rules. And they're just made up. And you might say, well, who cares about that? Well, they have some importance because they tell the world, it's almost like a promise, this is how we do our hearings. So they can become very important. Policies, guidelines. Statutory procedural codes. In Ontario, we have this really awesome thing called the SPPA, Statutory Powers Procedure Act. You guys don't have to be experts in that, but something you should spend a little time with and get a bit familiar with. It's super complicated as to whether the SPPA applies or not. I don't care, like for our purposes, if it's an Ontario DM, just assume it applies. Okay? So if you see an Ontario DM, and how do you know if it's an Ontario DM? I'm always going to do these stop and check in. How do you know it's an Ontario DM? Yes. What do you mean by the statute?
By the statute, there's a provision.
If it's an Ontario statute, yeah, it's an Ontario DM. If it's a federal Canada statute, it's a Canada DM, federal DM. I could throw either one at you, but they're both fair game. Okay, so that's an initial important thing you have to understand right at the beginning. Okay, this is Ontario. Okay, this is federal. But if it's Ontario, we've got the SPPA, Statutory Powers Procedure Act. And it contains all kinds of cool stuff around telling DMs, how they can operate procedurally. There's procedural benefits in there that you can take advantage of, and that may solve your problem. Right.
What happens if the enabling statute or other subordinate legislation overlaps and conflicts with the SPPA?
It's not likely to happen, but the general rule you should take is that the home statute, the enabling statute, rules. And as the SPPA comes in and negates it and attempts to undermine it in some way or negate it in some way, no, that doesn't work. Okay, but usually, no problem. Usually, what you see is you have the enabling statute. It says a few things, and the SPPA puts kind of like another layer on top of that. And they're not fighting. They're just sort of, oh, here's some more rules. But if you go in, and it's easy to just go in the SPPA, look at the index. You can just get it online easily. Look at the index, and you'll see all this cool stuff around, written hearings and evidence and timing and all this stuff, adjournments. Well, it's not that exciting, but it's in the procedural fairness world. It's totally exciting because it's all the stuff we talk about. So if you have a problem, let's say it has to do with adjournments or something, you read the home statute, you're probably going to say, well, there's nothing much here. You read the regulations, you read the code of procedure on the website, you still may not have much. So you go to the SPPA, and there's probably a section on adjournments. You go, aha, there's something here. This may be the answer to my problem. And remember, you're doing all of this before you even start to think about the common law. Right? Because it may be, who cares about the common law? It's complicated and confusing. I'm going to get my answer right there in one of these sources, right there in the home statute, right there in the SPPA. Yeah. Because you always start with the statute, right? For any problem, you start with the statute in our world, in our procedural fairness world. Okay. What would be the federal equivalent of the SPPA? Does anybody know? Trick question. There isn't one. So that's one of the differences between Ontario and federal. Federal, they don't have an SPPA. They just never decided to do something like that, but Ontario did. So that's a big piece that we need to think about when we're dealing with a procedural fairness question or problem.
Does pretty much every province and territory have a procedure act or equivalent?
Like I think it's like half.
Oh, okay.
I think BC and Alberta do, but some don't. Yeah, so it's not uniform across Canada. Don't worry, I'll never test you on anything outside Ontario or federal. You don't have to worry about that. Okay. And so there's common law, and look at that, common law is at the bottom, right? Because in a way, it's the last thing we think about. Because hopefully, we've already resolved our issue with those previous bullets. And we don't have to worry about the common law, but I'm going to test you on the common law. And if you didn't, now you do. Now you know. Because common law is just so important to be familiar with and to be comfortable with, and bringing a common law analysis to a procedural fairness problem. We absolutely need to, because in the real world, so many of these procedural fairness problems can only be solved with common law. You don't get easy answers up there. So that's where Baker comes in. And what we're going to know as the Baker factors, the 5 Baker factors.
Policy and guidelines, it says that it can become important. Is it because it can cause the legitimate expectation?
So which would become, what did I say?
The policies and guidelines.
Oh,
it
policies
said
and
It
guidelines.
could be important,
Yeah.
like for the future.
Oh, legitimate expectation,
Is it
yeah.
there? That
Yeah.
could be created?
So, okay, right, so that's a good point. So policies and guidelines, let's say I put out a policy saying, we will give people 30 days notice of a hearing or something like that. And we just made up. But we wrote a rule. Well then, once you say that, it's like a promise, the courts will often say, well, you have to keep your promise, and if you break your own rule, we're not going to be happy with that. So you can legitimate expectations. Yeah, we'll talk about that. That's a whole interesting, kind of complicated area, but we'll talk about that. Okay. In case you're really keen on the Latin, we've got these Latin phrases for the 2 components of common law fairness, right? Audi alterum partem, the DM must hear the other side. So the right to be heard, right? That's what that is. And then nemo judex in sua causa, I'm sure I didn't pronounce that right. The DM must not be a judge in his own case. So that's, remember, right to a bias-free decision. So these are very old concepts derived from the, and you probably heard or read about this phrase, the rules of natural justice. Rules of natural justice, which some judges still like to talk about. But for you guys, let's consider that that's old-fashioned. Nobody really uses that phrase anymore. We say rules of procedural fairness, or procedural fairness. That's the modern term. But you're going to see natural justice floating around.
That's the same, right?
Well, not really. That's where it gets, the rules of natural justice. With modern procedural fairness, it's sort of bigger than that.
Because they mentioned this during a lot of these.
They do, yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
What I understand.
I want you using the rules of procedural fairness. I don't want you using rules of natural justice.
What I understood is that the rules of natural justice were for the courts, the procedural fairness for the administrative
For
decisions.
NID, yeah.
So it's not that.
I don't think so. I mean, it may have been for the courts, and then it kind of drifted into admin law.
Because one of the
And
cases I
then-
read, I
yeah.
know she's talking about, like, understood that was the decision they were making, but
Yeah, just to know, and remember, so much of admin law is getting the language down, right? Speaking the language, because it's a weird language of admin law. So things like that, rules of procedural fairness, we have to use, that's the term we use when we talk about this.
Like, this might be a dumb question, like, what is natural justice? Like, does it encapsulate procedural fairness and, like, other stuff as well, or is it just?
No, it's the other way around. Procedural fairness is bigger than natural justice.
Oh, okay.
But let's not worry about that. We don't care about that. I'm not going to test you on it. It's not a historical class. But we mention it because it's still around. If we can't get rid of it, it's like just an annoying thing from the past that won't leave us alone. Yeah, rules of natural justice. Okay, fine. It's rules of procedural fairness, like modern. I mean, that's like since the 80s, basically. That's what we've gone with, and we've dropped that. We've dropped the old term. Okay. Yeah, so this, if you're interested in the history, the Cooper case from England, 1863, older than Canada. And in that case, they said, starting with Dr. Bentley's case from 1723, so they're tracing the roots of fairness. The courts start to establish that common law will require a person to be heard in some cases, even if the legislation is silent. So it's an old concept, certainly. But then there was this weird thing where they said, well, is it a judicial act? And if we call it judicial, then yes, fairness. But if it's not judicial, no. And actually, we still kind of do that. But that's just for interest. We'll get to the really important stuff soon. Okay, so here's something we have to think about. It's a bit of like rock, paper, scissors. I don't know why I said that, but so we have to think about this idea that fairness is a common law concept, and subject only to the compliance with the charter, may be limited or even ousted by ordinary legislation. Such is its importance, however, that courts will require specific legislative direction before concluding that this has occurred. So what does that mean?
even though common law rights are important, if the legislation like the statutes create others or tell that those ones are not applicable, then
Too bad.
Then
You
don't
lose.
matter anymore.
Too bad, so sad. Yeah, so let's go back to we're the legislature. We create this new thing called the commissioner, privacy commissioner. We say, we don't really want these hearings to be very fair. I don't think we would really say that out loud. Kind of offensive, but I'm joking. But so the legislature could say, here's a good example. Remember we talked about oral hearings? Now, they're great, and everyone wants an oral hearing. What's the downside?
Resources. We don't have enough resources.
Resources. But what else do we think about?
Time.
Yeah, time. Yeah, you're right. Time, resources. Oral hearings are brutally inefficient and slow and time-consuming, all that stuff, right? So we, the smart people in this room, we're the legislature. We say, we know this, and we say, we're going to create a privacy commissioner, but we don't want this person doing oral hearings because they're a nightmare. They're slow and expensive and dumb. We don't like oral hearings. Oral hearings are horrible, so we're going to write a statute that says no oral hearings, or all your hearings are in writing, period, done. And we can say, but no, in common law, I had a right. No, the legislature can just take it away. Your so-called right, even if you say, I had a right, a common law. We know the common law is not powerful enough to set aside legislation, right? So forget it. So we, as the legislature, we have the power to say, no, we're not giving you that right. We're taking away that right, we're taking away that right of procedural fairness. And they do it all the time. For example, when they say written hearings only, they're taking away the so-called right to an oral hearing. It's a good classic example, but it could be anything, any procedure. about adjournments or evidence or anything like that. It could be anything. So we as a legislature, we have the power to design it the way we want. Fair, unfair, so what? We have the power to make it, a little bit fair, moderately fair, really fair, whatever
There's no limit.
whatever we want to do.
There's no limit.
There's no limit. Well, there is one limit.
Sure.
Yeah. There is one limit, the charter. So if we all in this room get together and write a statute that's like super duper unfair, it'd be kind of a fun challenge to write the most unfair procedure ever conceived of. And we say, haha, nothing you can do about it. Well, some smart person's going to come along and say, oh, you guys forgot about the charter because that's like I know it's goofy, I call it the lightsaber. We got a lightsaber with the word charter on it, and we can strike that down. So that's the risk we take as a legislature, that someone's going to come along and go to a judge with the charter in hand and say, this statute is way offside procedurally, it's too unfair, so court, can you help me out here and just destroy it? Or destroy the part that's really, offensive, really unfair. So it could be, no oral hearings, strike it down. And that's kind of the balance, right? The statute rules, but only to a point where, and that's parliamentary supremacy, where rule of law can come in, and who's the rule of law champion? The courts. Using the charter, strike down.
So that would be
The
a
legislation.
constitutional challenge.
Yeah, constitutional challenge. Charter or Bill of Rights. We're going to learn both tonight. They basically they're going to do the same thing for us, but we'll talk about the similarities and differences. Okay. Sort of a wrap-up slide. I'll go to the last point. So what's next? When will the rights to procedural fairness be triggered? A common. When will we cross the threshold to give rise to procedural fairness rights? Again, at common law. And what we say is we often forget, oh yeah, the statute. Kind of the place to start, right? When it comes to procedural fairness. That's true, but again, we spend so much time on a common law that we often just kind of forget about it. Oh yeah, whatever statute, yeah, I know about that, but I'm thinking about common law. Yes, that's a good way to look at it, that if you read, the way I look at it, you read the statute and you say, there's nothing here that's helping me or even answering my question about a fairness issue. Let's say oral hearing. Our statute, I'll tell you, our statute doesn't say, well, it says we can do written hearings, but we don't have to. So then you say, well, is a person entitled to an oral hearing or not? I don't know. Let's look at a common law. And so often you're going to be left going, read the statute, I don't have an answer, I have to go to the common law to figure out this problem. Whatever it is. Procedural problem. Okay. So, a bit of the sort of historical development of the common law rights of procedural fairness. So if you go back far enough, although you have to go back pretty far, the courts basically said, well, if there's fairness in the statute, great, but a common law, common law doesn't really help you. But really, if you think about it, not that long ago, the Supreme Court of Canada, Nicholson, and Cardinal, then Knight, 1979, 1985, 1990, comes out what evolves is this common law trigger for procedural fairness. When is the court going to say, a common law, you must be fair. UDM must be fair to the people who you're affecting. And these cases are sort of like employment cases, which is interesting. But it doesn't matter so much, but we have this concept that emerges of like a trigger or a threshold, that's another word that we use, for the common law right of procedural fairness to exist. Remember, going back, I said there's the two questions, right? Is the duty of procedural fairness owed at common law? Yes or no? So these cases helped us decide that yes or no. Is the duty of procedural fairness owed at common law? And just a bit of a, it's pointing to what we're going to talk about in the later slides. Knight is the big case. I always say Knight is like the classic case because it's the third one and it kind of really brought everything into clear focus with the earlier cases we're talking about. And this concept of rights, privileges, or interests. So that's really the heart of the test is, are the person's right, or a person's rights, privileges, or interests at stake in the case? And if we can say yes to that, usually that means they're owed a duty of fairness. The problem with that is it's not really enough. Because the courts go on and say, yes, but, with preliminary decisions, not so much. We'll learn about that. Final versus preliminary. And then general versus specific. Remember the cell phone rates, general general decision like that affects a huge part of the population versus a specific affecting one person only. They say with general, probably not. The answer is probably no. But we're going to learn about legitimate expectation as a separate little thing. Okay, so overview of the concept of rights, privileges, and interests, our trigger for common law procedural fairness. Duty of procedural fairness in common law. So here's how they express it in Knight. Subject to some exceptions, that's important, some exceptions, it's well established that the duty of fairness applies to the decisions of public authorities, for example, executive actors, tribunals, officials acting under statutory authority that affect an individual's rights, privileges, or interests. Okay, so that's really the essential question that you ask. Okay.
Between criminal and Knight, it seems like before this controversial is I believe that Cardinal was early.
Yeah, Cardinal's 85, Knight is 90.
And they have all the same threshold,
Yeah, but we kind of learned more as we got to Knight. From Nicholson to Cardinal to Knight, we sort of get these added elements, and the test becomes a little clearer. Okay? And Knight introduces this idea of the three-pronged test. So we'll get to that. So this is an important slide because, so there's the idea of rights, privileges, or interests. So they tell you that it's sort of helpful but not helpful because they say, well, yes and no, because here's some exceptions. It applies to decisions, not investigations or advisory processes or preliminary processes that precede a decision. Okay? It also doesn't apply to legislative decisions, including policy decisions. That's the cell phone charge case. You know that, where it says not legislative decisions. Even though it's not legislative, it's like legislative. Like legislation, because it affects, kind of the whole population, or a huge part of it. And not emergencies. So those are the kind of key exceptions. Not emergencies. Okay, so let's maybe look at that first one. It applies to decisions. You could even put in there final decisions, but not investigations, advisory, or preliminary process that precede a decision. So let's take the example of, we'll go to criminal law, because it's kind of fun to talk about, even though it's not an in-law. But you're arrested, and the police, they're convinced you're guilty, and they throw you into jail, and they treat you badly, all of that, and they don't, you have something to say to them about why you're innocent, and they don't want to hear it. Then they bring charges, and so you say, if you run off to court and say, I didn't get fairness from the police, what's court going to say?
The rest was all.
Yeah, they're going to say they don't have to be fair to you. They're just investigating, and they might be biased, and they might have treated you badly. All of that. They think you're guilty because they don't like your face or something like that. The court's going to say that's fine because your fairness is coming later, and that's why we say this preliminary stuff. No, there isn't really a right of procedural fairness because it's preliminary. That's an investigation, an advisory step in a process or a preliminary process that comes before a decision. Generally, we say, no, there's no procedural fairness there. There's only procedural fairness, when the main event happens, the trial, in a criminal matter, the trial. Of course, there you've got a judge that has to be fair to you and fair to the other side, the crown. But before that, no, there's no fairness. Forget fairness. You're not entitled to it because it's an investigation where it's a preliminary matter, right? Then we get to legislative decisions. Again, the cell phone bill case, no procedural fairness generally. And also the courts will say, and we're going to see a case on it, if something is an emergency, then there may not be a right. If there's an emergency and a DM has to deal with that emergency, then the courts will say, well, they don't know the duty of procedural fairness. So they can deal with the emergency. Okay, here's a bit of again, the Nicholson Cardinal Knight. I won't spend too much time on this, but so Nicholson said 1979 was the big sort of step into the modern world. So when the consequences to the person are serious, the person should be treated fairly. Nicholson, who was fired, should have been provided notice before being fired. Then Cardinal comes along in 1985, and that's when they bring out the magic phrase, the duty of procedural fairness lies in every public authority making an administrative decision, which is not of a legislative nature, right? So they're already hinting at that limit, that exception, but which affects the rights, privileges, or interests of an individual. That's an or, right? Rights or privileges or interests of a person. And then Knight versus Indian Head, again, kind of the most modern, or the most modern of the three, pulling it kind of all together, follows Cardinal and is quite similar. So, here's the Knight test, which is the one that we're going to want to use from now on for whether a duty is procedural fairness is triggered. And they call it the three-pronged test because there's 3 points. 3 bullets there. So the nature of the decision has to be final and specific, not preliminary and general. Not preliminary or general. So final and specific. Nature of the decision, final and specific. The second bullet, we don't talk about very much, but we need to remember it. there has to be some kind of relationship between the DM and the person. Forget that. Director of Education's at pleasure status, not incompatible with the duty of fairness. Let's not worry about that piece. But you just say, well, what's the relationship between the decision maker and the person? Usually that's easy. Decision maker is somebody who can have an impact on that person's life in this context. And then the third point, the effect the decision will have on an individual's rights. So depending on the outcome, what impact could that have on their rights? And in that case, they said, well, that they had no problem saying here that there is going to be a significant and important impact. In my boating license case, I might have a problem on that third prong, right? I might meet the first two, but I might have a problem on that third one. So, and again, we go down here towards the bottom where we say the court identifies two types of decisions, legislative in general or administrative and specific. The latter type of decision attracts a duty of fairness. So specific, key word. Legislative in general is going to knock you out of this test and the right to fairness. Okay, remember, this is all we're doing here is deciding yes, no. Yes, duty of fairness, no, no duty of fairness. Very simple. So don't give it too much importance, because it's just a yes or no. It can be obviously critical, but it's just, can you open the door to fairness? That's all it is. We go elsewhere to figure out, well, how much fairness, and what does fairness mean here? In this case, that all comes later. Okay, this is just, are we getting in the door?
What if it's legislative but specific?
Well, legislative by definition is general. But it's possible you could have,
Would it have a case of
a bylaw that targeted, exactly, we're gonna learn about that. Yeah. So legislative in general, you could have a rule, a law that was very specific to, say, one person or one company. We're gonna learn that later. So the court said, well, we're not fooled by that. That's not really legislative. It's not general.
That would be Ron Corelli.
Yeah, Ron Corelli as well. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, a little more on final versus preliminary decisions, which we talked about. And remember, this is pretty critical because if it's not final, you're going to have a problem. You may not get in the door, right? Just like the police who treat me badly, and the judge says, "Boo-hoo, I don't care about you because you're going to get a fair trial." So too bad the police were not fair. Too bad. Your fairness is coming late. So historically, preliminary decisions, things like inspections, investigations, recommendations, were not subject to the duty of fairness at all. After Nicholson, this is re-examined. But for your guys' purposes, generally the law is these kinds of preliminary decisions that are not final are not going to attract the duty of fairness unless there's an exceptional case. So you guys can always try to say, well, I know it's preliminary, but there still should be fairness, and here's why. Be creative. So there's a huge amount at stake. It's preliminary, but it's so important to what comes later or something. You can come up with some creative thinking, but know that you're really up against it if it's preliminary and not final. Okay, the Abel case, not really that important, not super helpful, but it's an example. It is an example where an exception was found to exist. The dairy producers, This was about, okay, disclosure and this whole question, well, we're only at the investigation stage. How can there be a duty of procedural fairness in common law, right? We know, forget it. You're not, there's no duty of fairness. But still, in dairy producers, ultimately there's no duty of procedural fairness, but there was an argument made that, well, you know, what happens here needs to be fair because it has such a significant impact on the final outcome, right? So that's kind of your faint hope. You can try to argue that. And yes, I know it's preliminary, but it's really, really important to the whole case, and here's why. So you can try that. But again, the most important point to remember here is that to the extent it's a preliminary decision that you're dealing with, it's highly likely you're not going to get a duty of fairness. Because as we were saying before, you know, the court's going to say, your fairness is coming later. Don't worry about it now. It doesn't matter now. It doesn't matter now. So you, as a clever lawyer, are going to say, well, it does matter now, and here's why. You're going to try. You probably won't succeed, but you can try. Okay. Yeah, here, generally, no procedural fairness, especially if an investigator has no authority to determine anybody's rights. Investigators, what do? They gather the facts. Right? They're not making a final determination. The police don't convict. Right? The police investigate, bring it to court, who convicts. They don't convict. But there are exceptional cases, as we were saying. And this is just a reminder of what we were talking about before this bullet. Don't forget to look at the legislation itself and general legislative statutes like the SPPA, really the only one you have to worry about. So it could be something interesting and helpful in there on your issue.
Doesn't that become a little bit of a vicious circle then? Because don't we get into the issue where decision maker make their decision based on that investigation and that person never had a chance to see it?
Yeah, exactly. So that's where you're going to argue. You're going to, it's just preliminary. Who cares? Well, the investigator does an investigation, doesn't show you anything. There's this secret report. And then it goes to the person who decides and says, you know, guilty. There's a hearing, but they, you know, oh, but we can't show you the report. Or the report is so one-sided. Like you didn't get a chance to say, oh, your facts are wrong. You know.
It's like opens up the door to
Yeah.
everybody else in the
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. So it could open the door. So yeah, we learned that investigations generally no, but you can try to argue in a case that, oh boy, this investigation was so biased and so unfair, and it shut me so out of it that, boy, I knew I was just going to lose. Right? It was so one-sided that I never had a chance. All right, so there's this thing, I really hate that I have to teach this. It's kind of ridiculous, but there's this thing out there called legitimate expectations that exists on its own. I mentioned it before. A thing called legitimate expectations. So, what is legitimate expectation? Another source for fairness. And even if you failed, let's say you say, oh, I'm going to, try to establish that a duty of fairness was owed, and I'm going to look at the Knight case, and oh boy, I think I failed the Knight case. It's not working for me. This is your last hope, or maybe your last hope. But I got the doctrine of legitimate expectations. So what is that? And you, as a good admin lawyer, are going to look over the file. You're going to look for something that looks like the DM made a promise as to a procedural benefit. So let's say there's an email exchange between an investigator and the jockey. I don't know, I'm making something up here. there's an email exchange, and the jockey says, well, am I gonna have a chance to tell my story? And the investigator says, yeah, don't worry. There's gonna be a hearing and you'll have a chance to testify in person. And then it goes to the next stage, and they send a letter saying, yeah, we're gonna do this, we're just gonna do this in writing. There's gonna be no hearing, no oral hearing. We're gonna do this hearing in writing. And your jockey client is gonna say, but this person promised me, said I don't have a chance. Oh, forget it, that was just the investigator. Well, you as the admin lawyer are gonna say, hang on a second, that's a big deal. You can't promise a procedural benefit and not deliver it. And you can go to court and say, court, I don't even need night. Forget night. Who cares about night? I'm entitled to, or my client's entitled to an oral hearing because an oral hearing was promised. The DM promised an oral hearing out of their mouth. I mean, email. So something in writing, something verbal, a promise of a procedural benefit. Oh, don't worry, we'll send you a copy of that investigation report. And then you get a phone call. Oh, we changed our minds, we're not going to do it. You can't do that. You can't make, we're talking about procedure again, right? You can't make a procedural promise and then fail to deliver on that. Where else might a procedural promise come from? Somebody mentioned it before. A procedural promise. I don't mean, could be lots of places. Sorry?
Guidelines.
Yeah, guidelines, code of procedure, website. They can make little promises in there. They might not see them as that, but you're going to see them as that. They said they were going to give me this and that. Where else?
Statute.
Yeah, the statute itself can have a procedural promise. That's easy. This is mainly UK-based, but the Canadian courts have said, well, yeah, just like in the UK, it exists here in these cases where these promises are made.
Isn't it also, does procedure in this instance also include having the right to be consulted or something like that? I'm thinking of your boating guy, if it's just dues with his boat and recreational license, fine, but
Yeah.
let's say it's the new bylaws for boating on Lake Simcoe and your boat guy is the head of the Boaters Association with 2,000 members.
Well, again, so generally we say if it's that would be like a legislative or policy type decision. We say no, there's no duty of fairness at common law. It just isn't there. Even though you might say, oh, they should have consulted the boating association. No, the courts are not going to force somebody making that kind of decision to have a fair hearing and notify, even though for other political reasons or whatever, maybe they probably should, but the courts are going to say, no, we are not going to force common law procedural fairness on a DM that does that kind of decision. That's not what this is for. Even though it might not sit well with people, that's our world, right? That's our world that we're in. Okay. What's another way that somebody can make a promise even though it doesn't come out of their mouth or it's not in writing?
Best practices? Or pattern of
Yeah.
behavior?
Okay, so this is how I like to explain this one. So remember, it's either legitimate expectations is either I say something to you verbally, in person or on the phone, or I write something in an email or a letter, or I write something in a policy or on a website or a code procedure. But yeah, there's another one. Let's say there's nothing there. None of that exists. But you're in line. Think of it, sort of silly, but think of it, you're standing in a line waiting for a hearing. And you're like 10th in line. You're just standing there waiting for a hearing. And, the first person goes into the room, closes the door, comes out. I got an oral hearing. And then the next person, and then the next person, and the next person. And then you're the last person you get in, and they go, wait, no, go out, we're gonna do yours in writing. What are you gonna say? They're gonna say, we didn't promise this guy anything. Point to something verbal or in writing where we promised this guy an oral hearing. What are you guys gonna say in response to that?
Your actions.
Your conduct, yes. If you continually act in a way that, oh yeah, we give this benefit, think of the 10 people standing in line, waiting for their own, I get there. So they've acted in a way that's a promise. Conduct. So that's another kind of promise.
Is that the case of Serres?
What, sorry?
Serres case? The one of Paris? Is that his case?
Of conduct, it might be, yeah. We're going to talk about this right. Yeah. So for legitimate expectations, remember there has to, the way I like to say it is, there has to be a promise of that procedural benefit, whatever it is. I say oral hearing, I just use that example because it's a big one. But there are all kinds of others. Let's say disclosure of documents. If they always do disclosure over and over, and then they get to you and they don't, you're going to say, well, you promised by your conduct. Okay, so that's legitimate expectations. Yeah, a party, look at the second bullet point. A party directly affected by a decision may have a legitimate expectation as to a procedure based on the conduct of a public official. So out of their mouth, in writing, or by their, action, promise. So here's, an awesome Lord Denning case, Liverpool Corporation, a taxi case. It's an interesting situation where this doctrine came out in the UK. Municipal officials gave undertakings, I guess they were in writing, to the taxi fleet that the number of licenses would not be increased without a hearing and new legislation. Court finds conduct of municipal officials gave rise to a right. This was the kind of policy decision where even after the emergence of the procedural fairness doctrine, courts were unlikely to require the affording of participatory opportunities. So that means basically, wow, you would have had no case for procedural fairness at common law, but you were promised something, and we're going to hold them to that, which is kind of cool that they do that. So, bottom line, promises mean something, and courts will enforce those, which is great. So we can use that to our advantage in the right case. But remember, always use the word promise. If you're going to say, I don't know if there's a legitimate expectation here or not, this is so confusing, you look for the promise. Yeah, I don't think we need to go through these cases. The key cases in Canada is Old St. Boniface in Winnipeg, Supreme Court of Canada, where they said, yep, the doctrine exists in Canada. And they say, the court says, we're going to fix the problem where, based on the conduct of a public official, parties been led to believe that their rights would not be affected without consultation or, some kind of promise of a procedure. And it can exist on its own, right? That's why we have to teach it as a separate thing, because it can exist on its own apart from our normal common law analysis. Okay. This might be a good place to take a break because we kind of come to a wrap-up slide here, which I won't walk you through, but it's going to kind of summary. So let's take let's try to go for 20 after. break time. There's some key cases in there, and read the important cases. But the pink book is better at explaining fundamentals, and my slides are the most important thing. So people have just, thrown that into the fire
Yeah, that's what I want to do.
and done just
Yeah.
fine. You can't. I mean, I'm probably, I'm not supposed to tell you don't do this, but that's, that's the reality. And what I care most about is the slides. And of course, my lectures, which closely track the slides. And the cases that are important are the cases I put in the slide. The ones that, for me are fair game for you, that you should know. And I will also tell you, as we go along, what are the really important cases. It'll become pretty obvious, but, if they're in there, they're important. And if you see a slide in a case and you go, I don't get it at all, it's not making any sense, I need to understand that. Well, then you can kind of go to materials or, reread the slide or what have you to figure it out, because those cases are all kind of part of what we need to be comfortable with. There's a lot of cases, but so that's that. And the other thing I want to mention was, please email me. You have my email. Email me if you're lost, if you're, or maybe you just might have a quick question. Whatever, if you want to talk to me, I'm available. Email is probably the best way to reach out. And of course, Osgood has resources if you're really lost, and know that in admin law, if you're completely lost, you're definitely not alone. There's lots of people like you. So yeah, Osgood has resources for helping to get people caught up, so they're they're going to be okay. Anyway, you probably know that already, but yeah, I don't mind if you email. Okay. I think we have a ways to go. Oh, we're actually doing not bad. Okay, so we're going to maybe spend a little more time understanding this idea of legislative decisions and emergencies, where we say, and the courts have said, no, there's no duty of fairness of common law. Then we're going to have the most fun of the night by talking about Charter and Bill of Rights. Nobody agrees with that statement. Maybe someone does. Okay. So, legislative decisions and emergencies. Remember, we talk about those because these are a couple of situations when the duty of fairness does not arise at common law. But we say here, be careful of the word legislative because it may not necessarily be what you think it is. How far does it go? We know what a legislature or parliament does. It legislates, but we're talking about more than that. And at its core, the idea is that no, we're not going to interfere with the government or with the legislature or parliament enacting legislation. We're not going to say, oh, there's a duty of fairness. Like this is courts talking about. Well, there's a duty of fairness on legislatures before they enact legislation because it affects people and it's important, right? So there should be a duty of fairness. Well, the courts say, no. We know we're just not going to go there. That's not our job. When it comes to a legislative decision, no. We're not going to impose a duty of fairness. We know our place. We're going to stay out of it. So no duty of fairness in the legislative context. But how broad we get into these things like, okay, here's Martineau and Matsqui, a purely ministerial decision on broad grounds of public policy will typically afford the individual no procedural protections. Similarly, public bodies exercising legislative functions may not be amenable to judicial supervision. And Knight talked to us or told us about decisions of a general nature are also excluded. But you can see there's this kind of theme of general decisions, legislative decisions, general decisions affecting, a large part of the population. Those situations are F. Those situations do not trigger a duty of fairness. So we have this crazy case of Canada and Inuit Te Pirasat, Supreme Court of Canada from 1980. So what was happening here? This was, who's the DM? Who's the DM? CRTC. Does anybody know what they stand for?
Canadian Radio and Television.
Nobody ever gets this right. Like 1 out of 1,000.
Telephone Corporation.
Canadian Radio-Television and Telecommunications Commission. Really needs to be rebranded for the 21st century. Anyway, what do? They regulate telephone rates. In 1980, it was landlines. That's what it's talking about. Just like with cell phone bills. Bell Telephone wants approval of a rate increase. This group, the Inuit Te Pirasat, wants any kind of approval, conditional on improved service. So they were saying, complaining that our service is horrible, and CRTC, don't let them raise their rates unless they promise to fix the crappy phone lines and give better service, in our area. Anyway, so this long, ridiculously complicated situation. This group that said we have bad phone service, brings a motion to federal court for a declaration that it should have been heard in this process, where cabinet ended up making a decision. The court says that it goes all the way to Supreme Court, and ultimately they say, yeah, this is a general process, a legislative kind of process. No, there's no, they say to this group, this IT group, we're going to say no to your request to impose a duty of procedural fairness before the DM. Because, again, this whole notion of, well, what was at stake here was a general, quote, legislative, even though it's not really legislation, general legislative kind of decision where, no, we are not going to, we as the court are not going to impose a duty of procedural fairness at common law. Actually, they were saying cabinet is the ultimate DM. They say they weren't required to provide procedural fairness. And what do they say down in the little bullet points near the bottom? This is legislative action in its purest form. Cabinet's role is to respond to the political, economic, and social concerns of the moment. The role of the court is merely to supervise jurisdiction. No, we're not going to say there's a duty of procedural fairness on cabinet, first CRTC, then cabinet, when it makes this kind of decision.
So if there was like in the statute of the CRTC, there was something that said that there was a duty of procedural fairness.
A duty to notify.
Yeah, to notify whenever the telephone rates are
Yeah.
to be changed, then it would apply. But
Yeah, then you have your answer. Then you know who cares about common law. You have your answer. It's easy. Right. And they could have said that the enabling legislation or the home statute could say you must notify people in the community affected or whatever. And they don't do that. Then they made a procedural error, and that's the end of it. You go to court and say, court, this is an easy case. It said they're right in the statute. They should have notified us, and they didn't. So you need to force them to do that. Very simple. You're not into this whole common law analysis because the legislation gives you your answer. Okay. Canadian Doctors for Refugee Care. I don't know why I put that all in red. I think it was a newer case. Even though it's getting kind of old now. Okay, so the interim federal health program goes way back. It was first authorized by Cabinet Order and Council in the 1950s. And what it did was it gave health insurance coverage for refugee claimants. In 2012, Cabinet decides, it's not happy with this, and they reduce and, in fact, even eliminate coverage for some refugee claimants. The groups that were affected challenge on procedural fairness grounds. And they say, we should have had notice, or we should have been consulted on this decision. This is a big deal. Removing health care for a group of people. As it happens. In this case, people making refugee claims. What does the court end up saying? Federal court says Cabinet's decision to issue an OIC, that's what Cabinet does, Order in Council, is legislative in general in nature, does not give rise to participatory rights. And they say, look, this is the kind of decision that's affecting, big groups of people, different classes of people, including, of course, refugee claimants, lots of other stakeholders, including hospitals, provincial governments, this kind of thing. So they said, this is a classic case of it's legislative in general, not specific. Not like you or me or, a case involves an individual. So this is not the kind of case that's going to trigger a common law duty of procedural fairness. Just another example, really not surprising. So remember, what we look at here is the nature of the decision. We sort of say, well, we don't care who's making it. We don't care what kind of DM it is. We say, what's the nature of the decision? So we say the nature of the decision is determinative, not who the body making the decision is. Okay? So, we go to this example, which came up before, of bylaws. So what are bylaws? They're kind of like legislation, right? Albeit at the municipal level. City of Toronto or City of Wyoming Village, they pass bylaws, and you would say, normally, you would probably agree with me that, when they do a bylaw, like no parking after midnight on city streets or something, that affects everybody, right? Or everybody with a car. So that's a legislative kind of decision, right? Making a bylaw. This is a weird case because it's not going to happen very much. But it so happened that there was this bad situation in this town of Wyoming Village. Anybody know where that is? No? Near Sarnia. I've never been there. I know it's near Sarnia. Anyway, it's not in Saskatchewan. It's Ontario. Oh, it's from Coeur County. Yeah, it's Ontario. I guess it could have been Saskatchewan. Anyway, so Homex was a developer in that town, and they and the village were, moral enemies. They weren't getting along. There was a bad situation there. Anyway, the council of Wyoming decides to issue a bylaw that basically was, you can't build here. And they say, it's a bylaw, it's legislative. Well, it was pretty obvious when it got to court. They said, the court says, we see what you're doing here. You're targeting these people. In this case, a company, but it's like one legal person, a company. You're targeting this company because you don't like them, and you don't want them developing land, and you're trying to, affect them, shut them out. So they do a bylaw without notice, and Homex goes to court, and the court says, yeah, normally we would never say that there was a common law duty of fairness in this kind of situation, but here, this is unusual and different, and this is not legislative, again, even though bylaws normally are. So we're going to say there actually was a duty of fairness that was owed by the town or the village. And they say what we have here is not a bylaw of wide general application, right? Which most bylaws are, but it was one that was aimed deliberately at limiting the rights of one individual. Again, individual being a corporation. Homes. Maybe. Yeah. Oh, it's a crazy case. We learn about it later when it comes to clean hand, this whole doctrine of clean hands. You come to the court having been a really bad person and engaged in all kinds of misconduct. They'll say, you win, but we're not giving you the remedy because you are bad people. You're a bad person. We're not giving you the remedy, but you're legally right. Good for you. You win the case, but we're not giving you what you ultimately want because you're so terrible. Anyway, don't have to worry about that now. Okay, so we're just trying to understand, what does legislative really mean? What does policy making mean? Policy making, again, something of general application, general in nature. Again, why is that important? Because it means there's going to be no duty of fairness, common law. So there's this quote, which you can have handy in your back pocket. You can pull it out. This quote, I think it's a good one. Where the impact of the decision being made is diffuse, affecting a broad spectrum of the public in a generally undifferentiated manner. Claims to participatory rights, so procedural fairness rights, will be hard to justify unless the legislation contains some indication of public participation or obligations of consultation. Of course, we know that. But that language, I think, is kind of helpful to understand what is general in nature. Policy making is sort of a classic, general kind of decision. Okay.
Something about the previous case in the States. So this one is not legislative in general, or it is legislative but specific?
The Homex case,
Yeah.
they said if on the surface it appears to be legislative, but when we look closely at the situation, it's not legislative. It's specific. And it's specific because who does it affect? One person. Not like a parking bylaw or a typical bylaw that just affects, the population. This is very targeted. That's unusual, but we learn about it because we know what matters is who does it affect, and that's where this comes in. Does it affect a broad spectrum of the public? That's a good way to look at it too. Does it affect a broad spectrum of the public, or really only one person? And that's the difference. So the telephone bills, right? A broad spectrum of the public. Maybe not everyone. Some people don't have a phone, but everyone back then with a phone, almost everyone in the community is affected. So that's broad. It's not specific enough. This one just really fun because it's amazing. Admin law, the scope of admin law. Well, here we have a DM, in this case a minister, deciding on a quota for the importation of hatching eggs and chicks. What kind of stuff we need, We need to have limits on how many hatching eggs and chicks we can have imported. So the minister comes up with a new policy with a detrimental effect on historical producers. Federal Court of Appeal says here, when this kind of decision is being made, no fairness is required because it's a policy. It's affecting, in this case, an industry. Right? It's affecting a whole industry. So you see a lot of that. oil and gas industry or insurance industry or some kind of industry policies or rules or things like that, when it affects an industry, again, you can't, it's general, and the duty of fairness falls away. And they say, the court says, we're not going to help you. There's no duty of fairness. You want a remedy for this situation, you don't like what the minister's done, go the political route. You don't have a legal leg to stand on. This is a political decision. We, the court, we're not touching it. We're not going to impose a duty of fairness because, again, they respect their role. They say that's not our job. You know, we don't give remedies for general type decisions, only specific. Okay. This one is weird because it's sort of counterintuitive. INSEAC. This was a minister, a federal minister, deciding as a DM whether to surrender a person to U.S. authorities pursuant to a deportation order. So this is where it gets a bit weird because we say, well, of course, this is a decision that affects one person. But what did the court do? They say, yeah, we get that, but this decision is loaded with broader policy considerations. So we're going to call this, it's more really legislative in nature or general in nature, because what were the political ramifications of extraditing a person? This one's hard to get your head around. So just know that they're not always easy to spot, and what, to me, what looked really like a very individual impact decision, they say, no, it's general, because the minister was kind of deciding policy. Are we going to send people like this back to the U.S. when they're wanted in the U.S. for criminal conduct?
To me, it just sounds like there's a whole lot of the court not wanting to be seen as activists. So punting it
Yeah,
back.
we're staying out of it. This has got political overtones. Ooh, we don't, that makes us uncomfortable. We're going to back away. So they did a little bit of, we're not going to get involved. Yeah. I don't know if this case would be decided the same way today, but just so you know that sometimes you can describe something that might look individual as actually, well, that's actually more general. But let's don't get too hung up on this. I'm not looking to trick you. So you just need to understand the fundamentals of, what is the impact of this decision? Does it affect, again, a spectrum of the population? It doesn't have to be every, it doesn't affect all, 14 million people on Ontario. But if it affects a large, portion of them, that's of the population, then that's going to be general or legislative, no duty of procedural fairness. Okay, we have one more exception where they say, no, the court says, no, we're not going to find that there's a duty of procedural fairness. That's an emergency. I love this one because it's a blast from the past, having to do with the Post Office Act, 1966, the Randolph case. Private postal service was suspended by the Postmaster General under the Post Office Act to allow an investigation to come later, right? So they have a provision in their act that says they can do it without notice order. And the private postal service was not heard before they were suspended, right? A big deal for them, right? Their whole operation is shut down. They didn't get a chance to be heard. You can imagine why they would be upset about this. I thought they should get a hearing. The court says, no, we're okay with it because this was an emergency, and we're going to let DMs make, take quick action to deal with an emergency without all that procedural fairness stuff. And they said here, and don't worry about it anyway because it's an interim decision, and there's going to be a hearing. This company was going to get their fairness later, right? But they got shut down immediately. So that's another thing to keep in mind, is that emergency is another way that the court will say, no duty of procedural fairness here. Not going to happen very often, but it certainly can come up. Yeah, so this is again, it's another one of these wrap-up slides. And the key, legislative or general in nature is really, it's an important phrase. So those are the kinds of cases that don't get a duty of fairness, where a duty of fairness is not triggered, right? We're trying to use that language. Courts want us to use. We have to look at the context, substance over form. And then we've got the emergencies. Okay. So we've kind of covered the whole piece around when is a duty of procedural fairness triggered a comment. That's basically done that piece, which is an important piece. So maybe now is a good time to hand this in. It's going. I can also put it up on the screen. But yeah, I think it's a good time to look at the big picture and framework I've got here for you. Important document, you're going to have it by your side. I think you should travel with it, you should sleep with it. So, these are kind of the steps that you go through with any procedural fairness problem. And some of this will already be familiar. So I say, and this is how I would approach a procedural fairness problem, how I'd like you to approach one, where the first thing you do is you read the statute and the regulations. So I say the question is, does the whole statute or regulation or general procedural statute give you the answer to your procedural problem? Okay, because we know absolutely there are going to be cases that are solved, procedural fairness problems that are solved by the statute. Right? Let's say it says, oh, you have to, you have to notify all affected parties before you do your hearing. And they don't do that. Well, boom, you've got your easy answer. They didn't follow the statute, and that's fatal, right? You can't. A DM has to follow their statute. Absolutely fatal. So that's why we start there, because that could be the end of the story. You don't have to go to any of this other stuff. And here's the examples I'll give here. The statute or the reg says there must be an oral hearing, and it was denied. Well, you go to court and you enforce it. You say, I was entitled to an oral hearing. It's right there in the statute. Court, make the DM give me an oral hearing. Okay. Here's another example. The opposite. So what do you do when the statute says no oral hearings? You say, but I want an oral hearing. Too bad, so sad, right? Common law is useless, right? You can go do your fancy common law analysis. Well, it's going to get you nowhere because it can't rewrite the statute. But what can rewrite the statute? Charter or Bill of Rights. Charter or Bill of Rights. And you can get that thing struck down. Legislature says no oral hearings. I'm striking it. I'm going to go to court. They're going to strike it down and say yes, oral hearings. You can do that. And we're going to learn how that works, but that's a possibility. Short of that, though, forget it. The statute is, the statute rules the day. Third bullet. Oh, well, what happens if the statute or reg is silent or doesn't answer the question on, let's say, an oral hearing? And that's going to happen all the time. You're going to be like, nothing here. There's nothing here. I don't see an answer to my problem. That's like most cases in the real world. You say, okay, well, I've got to go to the common law. I've got to figure this out using my common law, tools, framework. The principles, the case law, all of that. Oh, but we make it easier for you because we break it down into components. That's B, common law. And just as we learned tonight, we say we always ask at the beginning of any common law analysis, is a duty of procedural fairness owed by a DM? If no, end of story. Can happen, right? Can happen. Legislative in general. And preliminary. So that captures a lot of cases. So you have nothing there. You're finished. Yeah, we have the night three-pronged test, which at the heart of it is rights, privileges, and interests. So we have to pass that three-pronged test. And we know that usually preliminary decisions are out, like investigations, and general decisions are out, like legislative or policy decisions, as we've discussed. Okay. If you're lucky enough to get through, you say, and you'll have these obvious cases like the jockey or jockey friend clearly is owed a duty of procedural fairness. That's pretty easy. I mean, I want you to do the analysis, but it won't be difficult. It'll easily pass in that kind of case. And then for number B2, we know, yes, okay, if there is a duty of fairness in one, that means the DM owes a right to be heard and a right to an unbiased decision. They're both essential elements. They have to be satisfied. Okay, so we just know that notionally. Great, those are the two rights. And you just leave that for now. Then you go to number 3 and you say, okay, what level of PF, procedural fairness, is owed? By the way, you can use that short form with me, PF, even on an exam or a midterm, because I know we know what we mean by PF, right? Or DM. So they're handy little shorthands. Of course, you don't have to use them. So in number 3, we say, what is the level of PF that's owed? And that's Baker. We're not going to do that tonight. So I'm foreshadowing to the next class. But Baker is our framework, the 5 factors, and we get out of that a low, medium, or high. Okay, don't worry, we're going to spend a lot of time on Baker and how that works. But what comes out of Baker is
Medium.
low, medium, or high. That's all. Doesn't give us the answer to the question. It's just low, medium, or high. Then we go to step 4, which is based on the level of procedural fairness owed, low, medium, or high, we go to a list of procedural benefits. Okay, you're going to wonder why I say Mandarin menu, because that's a joke I used where I say, I'll pretend that I'm just saying it out of the blue. Does anybody here like food?
Yes.
If you like food, put up your hand. Has anyone ever been to the Mandarin?
Yes, it's amazing.
Is that not the greatest restaurant in the universe? Stay with me. Yes, it's great. They have every dish under the sun, right? Every cuisine around the world. You got sushi, you got, Middle Eastern, like everything. You got it all. Awesome. I call it the Mandarin menu, right? Like every possible. Okay, so every dish at the Mandarin is like a procedural benefit. course, we all want everything. Like I go, you pile your plate up, it's like you barely carry it. You got spaghetti on top of like a cheeseburger or whatever. Anyway, and then sushi, chicken balls. I think I'm gonna go to the Mandarin later. So, as a joke, but it's actually good because it helps you remember. The Mandarin menu is like we're gonna see the Mandarin menu. You're gonna have to wait a while. Of the list of procedural benefits. Of course, everybody wants them all, right? But we end up learning that not everyone gets to eat every dish at the Mandarin, especially if you're medium or low. You don't get every benefit. Or you might get like a little bit of that benefit, but not like the best. So what's the classic example? Oral hearing. Everybody wants an oral hearing and everyone thinks they're entitled to an oral hearing. But the world of admin law doesn't work that way. That's what the Supreme Court tells us. They'll say, yeah, we understand that an oral hearing is the tastiest dish on the Mandarin menu and everyone wants it, but not everybody gets it. Not everybody gets it. So that's what I say about the Mandarin menu. So you're going to get a list of procedural benefits. You're going to go through that and go, yeah, you got that. You got, oh, he didn't get this. Our problem here. Something was, denied. With our problem. So then we kind of use that and use low, medium, or high to tell us, and of course the case law to tell us, well, what is a person like this really entitled to? How many benefits? And how good were those benefits? Mandarin menu. Okay. So this is the way we look at it. Again, this is introductory. We go through the Mandarin menu and we say, which dishes did you expect to get but did not receive? Is that a reasonable expectation based on the level of fairness? And what have the courts said about those benefits? Okay, and this is maybe a good time. Oh yeah, I used the example here. Oral hearing. Courts say usually we're not going to require that unless the level of PF is high. And remember, a serious case like Baker was not high, it was medium. So if Baker didn't get it high, it's like good luck getting high. You might, but it's not easy, right? It's not easy to put yourself in that high level of fairness. And you're going to see how that works.
If Baker had been here legally, she probably would have had tried.
Yeah, most likely. But remember, Baker was here illegally. She admitted it. So this was like an exception to the rule. So they say, we're going to, lower the fairness from high to medium. Okay, where was I going with this? Oh, yeah. So again, we have to get comfortable with the idea of the court saying, everyone's entitled, even if you pass the night test, everyone's entitled to some fairness. But the courts use this term, which I like. I've used it a number of times. We do not expect procedural perfection. Why is that? Don't we want a world where there is procedural perfection? Why shouldn't everybody be at high?
Because if everybody's high, then we're going to be like the courts, and then the whole reason of having admin law and so forth.
Yeah. So what's the point? Okay, the courts say we don't want all these people, these DMs out there being like mini courts. So why would they exist in the first place? There's no point. Why not just hire more judges and be done with it? Right? Of course, the courts say we understand the system of admin law. It's important. We respect it. And you know what they say to themselves? We don't want to do that crap. Judge will say, I don't want to be sitting in a landlord-tenant hearing. Like, come on. I do important stuff. So they respect and they back away and they say, we're going to expect them to give an adequate amount of fairness, but not perfect fairness. So if you try to get everything on the Mandarin menu, not only will you have a stomachache, but they're not going to give it to you. They're just not. Okay? So that's kind of procedural fairness, all there. And then we have the last little element, which we've already touched on, the idea that we can use the charter or the Bill of Rights to rewrite a statute that, again, we're only talking about procedure. We can rewrite a statute to say what we want it to say to give procedural fairness. I use this phrase, we may rewrite or strike down a statutory provision that is blocking you from your procedural benefit. The classic example being, hearings will all be in writing. Oh, that's blocking me. I can't get an oral hearing. I have one shot at this charter or bill of rights to change, to rewrite the statute. Otherwise, forget it.
So, the institute connection with A is,
Yeah, A and C kind of come together in a way. Yeah. I mean, you could almost put A then C, because you look at the statute, and I do mention it, right? Statute says what it says, and you're out of luck unless, you can use the Charter or Bill of Rights to fix that problem in the statute.
So we do a judicial review on charter grounds, and then
Yeah.
we change the charter and then apply it for you?
You bring a judicial review on charter grounds, you ask them to give you a charter remedy of fixing the statute.
Yeah, but will they still apply that for you? What do you want?
Apply what,
On the
sorry?
same case, they will review the hearing?
Yeah, we're gonna fix the statute, we're gonna send it back, right? The classic remedy, send it back, go do an oral hearing. You gave this person a written hearing, we understand that because of your statute, but we're rewriting it and we're telling you, go do an oral hearing.
Or they just might change it, send it back without even giving a recommendation?
No, I think if they're saying there was a procedural problem here, they're gonna direct it and say, fix your procedure, here's how to fix it.
The procedure has to be because I was thinking it has to be specific to that person that is bringing the issue. It can't be like a
Yeah.
general procedural problem.
Well, no, they would actually fix the statute, that means forever. Now
I
everyone,
know,
now
but
everyone gets it.
But it has to be bad for your case. You have to raise the point that in your case,
Yeah.
it is unconstitutional.
Yeah, because they want a live case to test the question.
Okay.
Like, I was entitled to an oral hearing, here's why. And the statute's in my way, so you need to fix the statute, court. Give me an oral hearing. If it helps other people, great, but for me, yeah, okay. It gets complicated to charter remedies and so forth. It's not that kind of case. But sometimes they'll just say, well, only certain people can get that oral hearing.
but, sorry, if you're bringing a constitutional challenge,
Yeah.
then you're striking down the provision of the statute, because that would be seen as unconstitutional.
Yeah,
So that would.
Which means that
change the
everyone-
whole process for other people as well.
yes, but the next person could come along and say, oh, I was entitled to an oral hearing too, and then they don't get it, and they go to court, and the court says, well, your friend from before had a good case for an oral hearing, you don't. So we're gonna let that go. You know what I mean?
Also, the statute now provides for oral hearing, but not for everyone.
Okay, so let's say there was a provision that said, all hearings in writing. So you strike that down, that means it's silent. And now they don't have to give an oral hearing, but they can.
So now we're.
So now the common law, now it's common. That you're either entitled to an oral hearing or you're not. So that's how that would work in that
What
case.
if the statute says maybe entitled to oral hearing or
Either way.
so that's for the decision
That's
to
when-
decide, right?
Yeah, so this, okay,
Do we vote?
good question. So, yeah, let's take that scenario. The statute says hearings can be orally or in writing. Some actually do say that. And you go and you say, I want an oral hearing, and they say, nope, we're giving you written. and you complain about that. You say, oh, I wanted an oral hearing. Anyway, so you go, you do your written hearing, you object, you go to court, and you say, you bring a JR, and you say, I know they can do oral or written, but I was entitled to oral because of A, B, and C, and I want you to court to back me up on this and send it back for a new hearing because I'm entitled to an oral hearing. I call them all. So you're going to have to go through the whole Baker test and say, because they're going to say to you, well, is it low, medium, or high? Under Baker, what do you say? Oh, it's high. Which will help you get an oral hearing. The other thing that, now that we're on the topic of an oral hearing, I think I said here somewhere that where credibility is at stake. Yeah, right at the bottom. So with oral hearing, courts usually say, no, we're not going to require it. DMs don't have to act like courts, like judges. We're not going to expect it unless they're high level of PF. But they also say, well, if it's say a medium or low, but credibility is at stake, we're going to see cases on all this stuff. We may require an oral hearing if it's a he said, she said situation. Who do we believe? Who's telling the truth? Who's not telling the truth?
Depending on the statute or the issue, it might be a default. Like, I think most landlord are oral.
Yeah, that's the way landlord and tenant.
Yeah.
They've decided that works for them. They do oral hearings, and these people are amazing. They somehow do quick oral hearings.
Yeah, but
They make it work, which is unusual.
The he said, she said is a big factor, I think, in that.
Yeah, I paid the rent. No, you didn't. It wasn't my fault that whenever there was a flood. Anyway, yeah. So that's oral hearing.
So about the second one, so the statute says no oral hearings. So can we ask for legitimate expectation here if they usually give an oral hearing?
Yeah. You can use. Okay, this is not. I didn't cover legitimate expectations. That's on its own. So I guess it's not complete. But under legitimate expectations, remember you've always got that as a last. You got last hope, and that might get you there if they promise something. They promise an oral hearing. You're right. You can throw that aside and say, I got legitimate expectations. I don't need any of this. If there's a promise. Now here's the thing. It's going to be probably easier for you because in Baker, here, one of the factors is actually legitimate expectations. Some of you might know that. So you won't forget it. It's right there in Baker, but it's weird because it's in Baker, but it exists on its own. Weird. But so you know that, but you know that you're going to have to examine in any PF case using Baker. You're going to have to consider legitimate expectations. So again, what I say is, was there a promise? Through words or actions. Words from the DM or actions by the DM.
Couldn't you just go straight to legitimate expectation? Right?
You can, yeah, that's why you can say.
It's always available.
Yeah, I know it's in Baker, but I'm going to go just on that because I got a really good case, got it in writing. Yeah, you could do that. Strategically, you'd probably do both.
And the right to be heard and the advice decisions, those ones don't go into the Mandarin menu. They're always present,
Okay,
right?
yeah, good question. Right to be heard is kind of the Mandarin menu. So did I make that worse?
Yeah, because it's the
Procedural benefits are the procedural benefits are the Mandarin menu. That's pretty much the right to be heard. Because the right to be heard is like a whole universe of things.
But advice decisions.
That's why it's a long list.
Advice decisions like to anything, even if it's law. Yeah.
Yeah, we know bias is its own thing. That you could see it as, again, it's another procedural benefit, but it exists outside the right to be heard. Right? And I'm trying to drill into you guys, at common law, what does EDU procedural fairness means? You say, well, it means two things: the right to be heard and the right to an unbiased decision. Okay, that's going to be second nature to you. You're going to know that. And you got it right here. But, for example, oral hearing comes under the right to be heard. Notice, right to be heard. Access to documents, right to be heard. The right to know the case against you, right to be heard, all that stuff. Yeah. And bias is its own thing. We're going to spend a lot of time on both of these things. Okay, so back to the slides. Any questions on this? I think you've got it. We're going to come back to it and back to it and back to it. So don't think this is it for that. We're going to look at it over and over. So we're on the the framework here. Because this is C, right? Charter and Bill of Rights. And have to talk about it because it's a important way for us to maybe get procedural fairness. When the statute is blocking us, right? That's the only time we're talking about it. We normally don't need it, but we need it when the statute is preventing us from getting what we want procedurally. So just a little bit introductory. What is the Canadian Bill of Rights? Well, that's federal legislation. So of course it only applies to a federal statute, the federal DM. A federal DM operating under a federal statute, Canadian Bill of Rights. And of course it is not going to apply to an Ontario DM. We need to be really careful about that and really clear about that. But of course we have the charter that applies to acts of parliament and legislatures and to bodies or activities that can be brought within the concept of government. This thing about universities and hospitals, forget for now, not worried about that. Okay, a little bit more about the Bill of Rights. Again, federally constituted entities only it applies to. It deals with individuals and persons. So what does that mean? It deals with individuals and persons. Who cares? You know what we're talking about, right? Why is it important? Corporations. Because corporations, we know legally, a corporation can be a person in the legal sense. So corporations have the advantage of being able to use the Bill of Rights, whereas the Charter, for our purposes, is really we're only talking about natural people. The Bill of Rights has property rights, the Charter does not. Let's not worry about that too much. The Charter has an express balancing provision, Section 1. Again, it's not a charter case, but just know that, let's say you try the charter and you've got a great case for a full and complete answer, you've got to say, oh yeah, although there's been a breach, we need to figure out whether it's saved by Section 1. Right? Have you guys taken foundations? Some yes, some no. this is limited, and I don't want to scare you, but you need to understand that's one of the key elements is that the charter, a breach of the charter can be saved by Section 1, which is kind of a public interest balancing. But I would not expect you to go into a whole huge analysis. Citing the Section 1 that it exists and needs to be dealt with is probably all you're ever going to have to do. Although, you know, even though the Bill of Rights doesn't have a Section 1, it's implied in the Bill of Rights. Public interest balancing. It's rarely argued, but we need to be aware of it, of course, when we're dealing with federal legislation. Okay. Autherson case, the government held funds of certain veterans. For many years, the funds were uninvested, so no interest was earned. 1990, the government started investing, but the legislation expressly states that there can be no claim for past pre-1990 interest. So a group of veterans in a class action sued the government of Canada. They argue that the statutory bar, so legislation, was inoperative because it deprived them of property rights without due process. Section 1A of the Bill of Rights. And it deprived them of a right to a fair hearing, which is Section 2E of the Bill of Rights. So I'll pause there. What are the sections of the Bill of Rights we care about? There's only two, and they're basically the same. They both talk about procedural fairness. 1A uses the term due process. 2E talks about a fair hearing. So for our purposes, they're basically the same. They give procedural fairness rights, and you can use them to strike down a provision of federal legislation that's in your way, that's denying you exactly that. It's denying you fairness. What does the Supreme Court end up doing with this? They say, forget it, this claim is no good, because we're talking about the legislative process. The argument was that Parliament should have held hearings. Parliament needed to be fair. But what did we learn? Parliament, in legislating, of course, that's a no-go place for the courts. There's no procedural fairness required in common law for general decisions like this. And it affected, kind of a whole class of these veterans who had funds to their benefit. For a whole class of people. Okay, and let's look at 1A a little bit of the Bill of Rights. People have, individuals have the right to life, liberty, security of the person, enjoyment of property, and the right not to be deprived thereof except by due process of law. What does due process of law mean? Procedural fairness, done. We're not going to get into anything more complicated than that. It's just procedural fairness. And they say, yeah, sure, that argument might have been applicable if there was an individualized adjudicative setting. But no, this is legislative in general. Process, no, doesn't apply. Section 2E of the Bill of Rights guarantees that no law of Canada shall be construed or applied so as to deprive a person of the right to a fair hearing in accordance with the principles of fundamental justice for determining his rights and obligations. And they say, no, that one too, for similar reasons. So again, for our purposes, they say the same thing in a different way. Fair hearing, fundamental justice. What is that? That's procedural fairness of common law. Now you go to the Charter, which is much more prominent, but really we look at it in a similar way. And it's only one section that we're worried about, well, plus Section 1. Everyone has the right to life, liberty, and security of the person, and the right not to be deprived thereof, except in accordance with the principles of fundamental justice. So, we have to look at that whole section and look at that. There's a qualifier. of life, liberty, and security of the person. So to access procedural safeguards in the context of Section 7, the person must first cross the threshold of establishing that their life, liberty, or security interests are impaired by the relevant decision. Right? So, that's a fairly high bar. Life, liberty, security of the person. That's not your everyday case. There's a threshold here that's got to be of a certain level of importance. But it gets engaged in a lot of different kinds of cases, like people seek the Singh case, seeking refugee status. Suresh, the case where there was a risk of deportation and a person being subject to torture potentially. In Charkawi, the security certificate process where people are held against their will based on a security certificate. Okay, this is where it gets a little complicated, maybe sort of beyond what I expect from you, but the Singh case says that, with the Supreme Court of Canada, that the Bill of Rights is triggered only where the statute provides some degree of procedural fairness. The statute may completely remove an adjudicative process, and therefore in that situation, the Bill of Rights is not triggered. Okay, there's a couple of cases on that. Getting a little too esoteric and beyond, again, my expectations of you, but it's just kind of a side note. Okay. Much more important than the Charkawi case. So some of you may know, sort of historically, it's going back a ways now, that Parliament developed a complex legislative scheme to balance the need to keep information secret with procedural obligations owed to individuals who may be subject to a security certificate. Right? People who are, the government thinks they're at risk of conducting terrorism in Canada, so they've got this scheme where they say, more or less, we're not going to, in a way, it's like saying, we're worried about you, we think you're a risk, but we're not going to tell you why we think so. That's for us to know. It's none of your business. You're in jail. They thought they were striking the right balance. So we look at that, and this individual who's being held, the Supreme Court of Canada says, well, okay, let's look at Section 7. Yeah, Section 7 applies. Liberty and security of the person at stake. So yeah, we got our trigger for Section 7. So what do you do next, right? Everyone has a right to life, liberty, security of the person, and the right not to be deprived thereof, except in accordance with the principles of fundamental justice. Okay, what does fundamental justice mean? And that last bullet, major bullet, principles of fundamental justice, what are they? Of course, this is what they are. These four things. You're entitled to a hearing by an independent, impartial judge. That's number 2. Number 3, decisions should be made on the basis of facts and law. And 4, the person has a right to know the case put against one and to answer it. Okay, step back for a moment. That's what they said. This is what fundamental justice means. For our purposes, fundamental justice, I think we can simplify it and say that means what we understand is procedural fairness and common law. That's fundamental justice. Okay. But they decided they were going to really drill down and say these are the elements of fundamental justice. But in a way, they kind of summed up procedural fairness. Okay, so they say, well, one of the elements here is you got to know the case that's against you, right? If you were arrested and the cop said, I'm not telling you why I'm arresting you, but I'm arresting you and you're in jail. You'd be like, well, what did I do? Maybe it was obvious, but maybe you have no clue. And they say, yeah, we're not telling you. You'd say, no, that's not right. And then there's a hearing, and they're still not telling you. And you're going to be before a judge, and they're not telling you anything. You know, that's tough for us to accept. So the court's saying, well, you know, this scheme that they've set up, bit of a problem on the case to meet, because the way they developed it, like, they keep the person really in the dark. There has to be an adequate opportunity to know the case that's being made against you and that you have to respond to. And I say, yeah, we get it. We get national security concerns. Yeah, we totally respect that. But, and that can limit, you know, fairness rights. But they say, you know, in this case, we don't like where they struck the balance. It's off. There were, you know, sort of too many fundamental elements of fundamental justice, notice of the case to be met that we're missing. We're not happy. We're using, by way of the Charter, Fundamental Justice, Section 7. We're striking this down. This legislation does not pass charter scrutiny. It's just not fair enough. And they went to Section 1 in the Charter, and they do their Oakes analysis, and they say, yeah, it doesn't get saved by Section 1. That probably took 100 pages to write that part. Again, you don't need to be a sophisticated Charter Section 1 analyst, but no, that's it. So that's a really, you know, a good example of how Section 7 can be used. Again, you're only using it when the legislation is your problem. And again, I like to use the phrase, it's blocking you from getting what you want. This person says, well, I want more disclosure. I want to know the case that I have to meet. They're not telling me enough. And he ends up winning the day. The court agrees. And obviously there's a lot at stake, so it was very easy to say life, liberty, security of the person. That threshold is met. You're going to come across all kinds of cases where, you know, you're not going to be able to meet it. But we're going to see, actually, in the next few slides, the courts take the phrase life, liberty, security of the person, and they kind of, you know, they start to stretch it. It starts to look bigger than you would think. Okay, so how do they stretch it? So immigration cases are classic Section 7 cases. Prison, discipline, parole, you know, where you're being held or not held. But where else can it apply? Can it apply to economic interests? What about other state actions? Like delay, or we have a case about child protection. We're going to see, you know, foreshadowed that Section 7, life, liberty, security of the person, is maybe broader than you would think. So we have opportunities there to argue it, more than, again, you might think. So the Wilson case. This is a BC case. So the province of British Columbia introduces a scheme that has the effect of restricting the geographic location of doctors' practice. Court says, well, this BC Court of Appeal, they say, well, Section 7 doesn't apply to property or pure economic rights. They say that, but then they say, well, but in this case, the interest should be characterized as the right to pursue a livelihood or profession. Nice little dance there, right? Well, we're not really talking about money. We're talking about the right to pursue a livelihood, but isn't that kind of the same thing? But you can see where they went with it. They said, you know, it's more than just the person's owed money. It's their right to pursue a livelihood. So they kind of elevate that and they say, this is about, you know, life, liberty, or security of the person. Your right to pursue a livelihood. So boom, the door's now been opened. Who's our friend who can now use this? Yes, let's not forget the jockey, right? Suddenly, that person who you thought, oh, you know, boy, I wish they had a charter argument, but I don't see it. You're going to be like, oh, well, maybe they do have a charter argument. Under Section 7, the right to race horses, because that's what he does for a living. So we got Wilson. Yay. That kind of opens the door wider than we thought. And it was actually successful. The court says the procedure established for this, these kinds of decisions was not in accordance with fundamental justice. It was not fair. And they struck it down. New Brunswick Minister of Health. And here the issue was, again, something else that's pretty serious. That ended up falling within security of the person in Section 7, the removal of one's children from their home. They say, look, the potential removal of this child from the home, by Children's Aid Society, would have a serious and profound effect on the parent's psychological integrity. Okay, so, and not to trivialize, but so the court is saying this is serious. The psychological impact of this kind of decision is so profound that we say, yep, life, liberty, security of the person is triggered. Again, something you might not normally expect. So it's expanded into these other areas. Glencoe. So this is a weird one. So this is about delay in timing. And you wouldn't expect that, waiting a long time for a hearing affects life, liberty, or security of the person. But look at what happened here. This is really interesting. So this is a case where a very senior government official, a minister, was accused of sexual harassment. The premier, upon becoming aware of this, removes him from the cabinet. Then two people made complaints about his conduct to the Human Rights Commission. And then there's an investigation. But this investigation goes on and on and on. It takes 30 months just to schedule a hearing for 1998. Now we're 3 years down the road. Glencoe brings a JR application to have the complaints stayed because of unreasonable delay. Okay, so remember the Mandarin menu? One of the things on the Mandarin menu is the right to a quick hearing, or not an unreasonable delay in getting a hearing. That's one of the benefits. He said, I'm being denied that benefit of a quick hearing. This goes all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada, and they end up agreeing with the BC Court of Appeal, and they say, yes, Glencoe's charter rights were compromised under Section 7. Just by the delay. Because of the psychological impact, they say an inordinate and undue delay could result in stigmatization and impairment of Glencoe's psychological integrity. Actually, they end up saying, yes, theoretically he's right. That could be the case, but sorry, Glencoe, we're not buying it from you. We're not buying it from you. But they establish this idea that, in the right circumstances, yes, delayed could fit Section 7, life, liberty, or security of the person. So this idea of psychological stress, integrity, dignity, is another way for us to get in the door. So if you see a case where you go, oh boy, there's some pretty significant delay in getting a hearing, and I think I can use that by way of the charter. Again, to argue for fairness rights. Again, we're using it to strike down or rewrite a statute. Okay, so we've hit the end of the road for the slides for today.
Why did Glencoe want to rewrite the statute?
It's sort of complicated. It's funny how the statute came in. I think he wanted, in a way, to have like something written into the statute to say.
So you can also do charter to write.
You can write in.
So technically, you can always write charter.
Yeah, right. But no, I'm glad you're asking because we don't normally need it. So what a lot of students do is they say, "Oh, I better throw in a charter," because what if I don't and I'm going to lose credit? Like the charter just doesn't come up very often. And my approach, you probably have heard me say this. I'm not about tricking people or anything like, aha, that was a charter question, you didn't know it. I hit it. I don't really do that. But I do want you to be comfortable with the idea of, again, if the statute is blocking you, that's your lightsaber. Again, this might help you remember. Your lightsaber to literally strike down a statute. Okay? We have to know that. We have to know that. Because it does come up in real life. This is not just esoteric. It comes up, and you're going to need to be aware of it. Again, I'm not going to trick you. So don't throw in that people. Again, people throw in the charter because they think, well, I bet. But most of the time, it doesn't apply. Hopefully, my questions to you will be straightforward, and you'll know whether you need to bring out the charter or not. But it's just another tool, and with the procedural fairness framework, you're always going to be reminded of it. So you're not going to forget because it's right there as you go through it, and it's going to be, it's going to jump out at you, and you're going to think about whether you need to pull that tool out or that lightsaber out to use it. But most of the time, you're not going to need to. I'm just going to get back to the wording of the section, which is there. So I'll highlight that, and that is pretty clearly tells you you've kind of got the two: the trigger, life, liberty, security of the person, and then fundamental justice, which is procedural fairness, what we know as procedural fairness.
You mentioned earlier that it only applies to federal statutes.
Bill of Rights. Bill of Rights is limited, only federal. It only applies to Parliament, federal statutes, and federal DMs under federal statutes. Whereas charter, of course, can apply to both. So with federal cases, they'll often say, I'm going to bring in the Bill of Rights and the charter. And usually the analysis is going to be almost the same. But of course, with Ontario, we only have the charter, don't have the Bill of Rights available to us. So that's really important to get that at the beginning. Okay, so in the, where's the framework? Here, so where are we? We're really at B2, or we're going to start B3 next class, because that's when we're going to spend a really large amount of next class. We're going to talk about Baker and the Baker test. It's really, I don't know how to stress this, I can't stress it enough. It is one of the two most important things that you have to do. One is apply Baker, determine the level of procedural fairness owed, and then use that to decide what to do in your situation. The low, medium, and high, and then apply it. In procedural fairness is kind of the heart of what you need to understand. So your midterm is going to definitely involve Baker, which is why, I don't hand it out so early, because we haven't even really gotten there yet. But after next class, at the end of next class, you're going to be familiar with Baker. And again, that really, really important analysis of how much fairness is that person owed, low, medium, or high. That's what we decide. And or menu comes later. After your low, medium, or high. Okay. So, yeah. That's where we are. And, well, actually, we did C, right? We did C. We've gotten quite far. Okay. So, yeah, we're early again. Not as early. But I'll stick around if people have questions. I know we're getting, we're starting to pick up speed. Let me know if you're lost. Or, yeah, if you have questions about anything. Otherwise, have a good night. It's a long time. What's our next class?
4 weeks.
Crazy long break. I apologize for that. That's because I just had these conflicts. So I had to kind of push things up.